A deafening crack of thunder jolted the sleepy town of Fort Smith, Arkansas, to attention as Grace Turner clung to the frayed wooden ropes of Henderson Bridge, her knuckles white and her tears mingling with the rain that pummeled her face. The year was 1878, and the usually tranquil Arkansas River beneath her had transformed into a raging torrent, swollen by 3 days of relentless spring storms that threatened to wash away everything in its path, including the once sturdy bridge that now groaned and splintered beneath the weight of nature's fury. "She's hanging from the bridge," they cried, the voices of townsfolk barely audible above the howling wind and driving rain. Quentin Blackwell had just ridden into town, his cattle drive complete and his pockets heavy with earnings when he heard the commotion. The tall, broad-shouldered cowboy dismounted his horse in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the muddy ground. "Stand back," he ordered, pushing through the crowd that had gathered at the bridge's entrance, their faces etched with horror and helplessness. He saw her then, a woman in a rain-soaked blue dress, hanging precariously from what remained of the bridge's side rail, her fingers slipping against the wet wood. "Then I'll catch her fall myself," Quentin declared, shrugging off his duster and hat, handing them to a stunned bystander before rushing onto the buckling structure. Grace had only wanted to retrieve her younger brother's prized wooden horse that had blown onto the bridge during the storm. Now, as the bridge collapsed beneath her feet, she found herself dangling 20 feet above churning, debris-filled waters, her life flashing before her eyes. At 24, she had experienced more than her fair share of hardship after losing her parents to influenza 2 years prior, leaving her to raise her brother alone while running the family's small mercantile shop. "Hold on," a deep voice called out, cutting through her panic. She looked up to see a man she didn't recognize inching toward her, his determined expression visible even through the sheets of rain. "I can't hold on much longer," Grace cried, feeling her grip weakening with each passing second. Quentin calculated the distance between them, knowing he had mere moments before the entire section gave way. At 30 years old, he had faced stampedes and outlaws, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of this woman's fear-filled eyes boring into his, silently pleading for salvation. "Trust me," he said, extending his hand as he secured himself against a remaining post. "Let go with one hand and reach for me." Grace hesitated, terror paralyzing her. Another crack sounded beneath them, and she made her decision. With a desperate prayer, she released her right hand and stretched toward his outstretched fingers. Their hands connected just as the section of bridge she clung to broke free. Grace screamed as she felt herself falling, but Quentin's grip was iron, and he pulled her against him with such force that they both tumbled backward onto a more stable part of the bridge. "We need to move now," he commanded, helping her to her feet. They stumbled together toward safety, the bridge disintegrating behind them with each step. Just as they reached solid ground, the final section of the bridge surrendered to the river's might, crashing into the swirling waters below. The crowd erupted in cheers as Quentin and Grace collapsed onto the muddy embankment, gasping for breath. She looked at her savior for the first time, clearly rain-soaked dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and a face bronzed by years under the sun. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the continued roar of the storm. "You saved my life." Quentin nodded, helping her to her feet. "Quentin Blackwell," he said simply. "And you are Grace Turner," she replied, suddenly aware of her soaked dress clinging to her frame. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering from both cold and lingering fear. A small boy broke through the crowd, throwing himself at Grace. "Gracie, I thought you were gone," he cried, his small body trembling. "I'm all right, Timothy," she soothed, holding her brother close. This man saved me. Timothy looked up at Quentin with wide, awestruck eyes. "Are you an angel?" he asked with childlike sincerity. Despite the gravity of the situation, Quentin laughed, a warm, rich sound that seemed to momentarily push back the storm's chill. "No, son. Just a cowboy passing through." Sheriff Daniels pushed through the crowd, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Turner, are you hurt?" "No, Sheriff. Thanks to Mr. Blackwell here." The sheriff nodded respectfully to Quentin. "That was some heroic action, Mr. Fort Smith won't forget it." "Anyone would have done the same," Quentin replied, retrieving his hat and duster from the bystander who held them. "Not anyone," Grace contradicted softly. "Not everyone would risk their life for a stranger." The crowd began to disperse as the rain intensified again. Sheriff Daniels offered to escort Grace and Timothy home, but Quentin intervened. "My horse is just there," he said, pointing to a magnificent chestnut stallion standing patiently in the downpour. "I can take them if Miss Turner doesn't object." Grace hesitated only briefly before nodding. "We'd be grateful, Mr. Blackwell." Quentin lifted Timothy onto the horse first, then helped Grace mount before swinging up behind them. With one arm securely around Grace's waist, a necessity for safety that nonetheless sent an unexpected warmth through her chilled body, he guided his horse through the muddy streets toward the address she provided. The Turner Mercantile stood on the corner of Main Street and Pine, a modest two-story building with the shop below and living quarters above. By the time they arrived, the rain had finally begun to slacken, though the sky remained ominously dark. Quentin helped them dismount and followed them to the door, where Grace fumbled with shaking hands to find her key. "You should get into dry clothes right away," Quentin advised, noticing her continued trembling. Grace nodded, finally managing to unlock the door. She turned to face him, rain dripping from her dark blonde hair. "Would you like to come in? I can make coffee, or perhaps something stronger." "It seems inadequate for what you did, but coffee would be fine," Quentin interrupted with a gentle smile. "Though I should see to my horse first." "There's a small stable around back," she offered. "Not much, but it's dry." Quentin nodded appreciatively. "I'll join you shortly then." While he tended to his horse, Grace hurried upstairs with Timothy, helping her brother change into dry clothes before quickly changing herself. She braided her damp hair hastily, donned a simple gray dress, and stoked the fire in the small stove before putting on water for coffee. Her hands were still shaking as she set out cups and plates, her mind replaying those terrifying moments hanging from the bridge. What had possessed her to venture out in such weather for a toy? Yet when Timothy had cried over his lost wooden horse, the last gift their father had carved for him, before falling ill she couldn't bear his tears. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Quentin standing there, his tall frame filling the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Please come in," she said, stepping aside. Quentin ducked his head slightly to enter the modest living space above the shop. The room was small but neat, with simple furniture and a few personal touches that spoke of a home well loved despite limited means. "Your brother asleep?" he asked, noticing the boy's absence. Grace nodded. The excitement exhausted him, and he was up most of last night, frightened by the storm. She gestured to a chair by the small table. "Please sit. The coffee's almost ready." Quentin sat, placing his hat on the table before him. His eyes took in the details of the room, the carefully mended curtains, the small bookshelf with well-worn volumes, a framed daguerreotype of a couple he assumed were her parents. "You run the store downstairs?" he asked, making conversation. "Yes," Grace replied, pouring the coffee into cups and bringing them to the table. "It was my parents before they passed. Not a grand establishment, but it serves the town well enough." And your brother, no other family, a shadow crossed her face. No, it's just Timothy and me now, he's 8. She sat across from him, cradling her cup for warmth. What about you, Mr. Blackwell? What brings you to Fort Smith? Quentin, please, he corrected gently. I was driving cattle to the railway in Little Rock. Thought I'd stop here before heading back to my ranch in the Oklahoma Territory. You own a ranch? Grace asked, impressed. Small spread about 40 miles northwest of here. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. There was pride in his voice that Grace found herself admiring. Started with 10 head of cattle and a run-down cabin 6 years ago. Now I've got over 200 head and a proper house. That's quite an accomplishment, Grace said sincerely. It's been hard work, Quentin acknowledged, but worth it. He took a sip of his coffee. This is good, thank you. A comfortable silence fell between them, punctuated only by the occasional rumble of distant thunder and the steady patter of rain on the roof. I never got to ask, Grace finally said, what you were planning to do in Fort Smith before you became an unexpected hero. Quentin smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weather-worn face. Truthfully, find a decent meal, a bath, and a bed for the night before heading back tomorrow. Well, I can offer you a meal at least, Grace said impulsively. It's the least I can do. That's not necessary, please, she interrupted. I insist. If not for you, Timothy would be. Her voice caught, unable to complete the thought. Quentin reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his own. The gesture was simple but comforting. A meal would be welcome then. Thank you. Grace busied herself preparing supper, a simple but hearty stew that had been simmering all day, with fresh bread she'd baked the previous morning. As she worked, she became increasingly aware of Quentin's presence, his quiet strength filling the small room. There was something different about him from the cowboys who occasionally passed through Fort Smith, a thoughtfulness behind his eyes, a gentleness in his manner despite his obvious physical power. The way he'd reached for her on that bridge, without hesitation or thought for his own safety, spoke of a character uncommon in her experience. They ate together, their conversation flowing more easily than Grace would have expected with a stranger. He told her about his time as a ranch hand before saving enough to buy his own land, about the challenges of establishing himself in territory still raw from the recent war. The war changed everything, Quentin reflected. Came back to find my family's farm in Tennessee taken by the bank. Had to start over with nothing but the horse I rode home on. You fought? Grace asked, noting the shadow that crossed his face. Confederate cavalry, he admitted. Not something I'm proud of now, but at 19 you don't question what your father and brothers are fighting for. Grace nodded, understanding. Arkansas had been deeply divided during the conflict, and Fort Smith still bore the scars of occupation by both sides. My father refused to choose a side, she said. Said the store would serve anyone with money to spend, regardless of their politics. It nearly cost us everything when soldiers from both armies took offense. As the evening progressed, they shared stories of their lives, finding unexpected common ground in their experiences of loss and rebuilding. When Quentin finally rose to leave, Grace was surprised by her reluctance to see him go. The Arlington Hotel should have rooms, she suggested. It's just 3 blocks down Main Street. Quentin nodded, reaching for his hat. I appreciate the meal and the company, Miss Turner. Grace, she corrected, echoing his earlier request. After today, I think we're beyond formalities, Mr. Blackwell. He smiled, that genuine expression that seemed to light his eyes from within. Grace, then. He paused at the door. I'll be in town another day or two, waiting for the roads to dry enough for travel. Perhaps I could call on you again. Grace felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her near-death experience. I'd like that, she replied simply. After he left, she checked on Timothy, finding her brother sleeping peacefully. His cherished wooden horse, which Quentin had somehow retrieved from the remains of the bridge without her noticing, clutched in his small hands. The sight brought tears to her eyes, a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear at how close she'd come to leaving her brother alone in the world. As she prepared for bed, she found herself thinking of Quentin's steady blue eyes and the security she'd felt in his arms as he pulled her from certain death. It was foolish, she knew, to feel anything for a man she'd just met, a man who would be gone from Fort Smith within days. Yet as sleep claimed her, it was his face that followed her into dreams far gentler than she'd expected after such a harrowing day. The following morning dawned bright and clear, as if the storm had never happened. Grace opened the store as usual, though with fewer customers than normal, as many townsfolk were busy assessing and repairing storm damage. Those who did come in were full of questions about her experience and praise for the mysterious cowboy who had saved her. Shortly after noon, the bell above the door jingled, and Quentin himself stepped into the store. He'd clearly visited the barber, his dark hair neatly trimmed and his face freshly shaven, revealing a strong jaw previously hidden beneath several days' growth of beard. "Good day, Miss Turner," he greeted formally, aware of the curious eyes of the elderly woman examining fabric bolts nearby. "Mr. Blackwell," Grace replied with equal formality, though she couldn't suppress the smile that came unbidden to her lips. "How can I help you today?" "I find myself in need of supplies for my journey home," he said, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that belied his casual words. Grace showed him various goods, conscious of Mrs. Peterson's poorly concealed interest in their interaction. When the elderly woman finally made her purchase and left, Quentin's demeanor relaxed visibly. "I actually came to see if you might join me for supper tonight," he said directly. "At the hotel restaurant. I hear they serve a fine roast beef on Tuesdays." Grace hesitated. "I'd need to arrange for someone to watch Timothy." "He's welcome to join us," Quentin offered immediately. "That is, if you don't think it improper to dine with a man you barely know." Grace couldn't help but laugh. "I think we're past worrying about propriety, Mr. Blackwell. You've already had your arm around my waist on horseback and seen me in a thoroughly drenched state." A flush crept up Quentin's neck, but his eyes twinkled with amusement. "Fair point. Shall I call for you at 6 then?" "We'll be ready," Grace agreed. After Quentin left, Grace found herself humming as she straightened inventory, earning curious looks from her assistant Bessie, a local widow who helped in the store 3 days a week. "That the cowboy who pulled you from the bridge?" Bessie asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "Yes," Grace admitted, knowing there was no point in denying what would soon be common knowledge in the small town. "He's invited Timothy and me to supper at the Arlington tonight." Bessie's eyebrows rose. My, quite the gentleman, isn't he? And handsome too, if you don't mind my saying." Grace felt her cheeks warm but didn't contradict her. Quentin Blackwell was indeed handsome, though she found his kindness and quiet strength far more appealing than his physical attributes. "It's just a meal, Bessie. He'll be leaving town tomorrow or the next day." Bessie responded noncommittally. "Still, a woman in your position should keep her options open. Not many men would take on another man's child, but a widow with a ready-made son might be just what a lonely rancher needs." "Bessie!" Grace exclaimed, scandalized by the older woman's blunt assessment. "He saved my life. That's all there is to it." Bessie just smiled knowingly and returned to her dusting. Despite her protests, Grace found herself taking special care with her appearance that evening. She wore her best dress, a deep green that complemented her hazel eyes, and styled her honey blonde hair in a more elaborate arrangement than her usual practical bun. Timothy, excited by the prospect of dining in a real restaurant, scrubbed his face without complaint and allowed her to slick back his unruly brown hair. Quentin arrived precisely at 6, dressed in a clean shirt and vest that, while not fancy, showed he'd made an effort. He presented Timothy with a small carved wooden horse, more detailed and finely crafted than the boy's beloved toy. "To join your herd," he explained as Timothy's eyes widened with delight. "Every cowboy needs more than one horse." The gesture touched Grace deeply. This man, who owed them nothing, had taken the time to think about what might please her brother. The Arlington Hotel's restaurant was the finest establishment in Fort Smith, its white tablecloths and crystal glasses speaking of a refinement usually beyond Grace's modest means. She felt momentarily self-conscious as they were led to their table, aware of the curious glances from other diners who recognized her as the woman from the bridge incident. Quentin, however, seemed completely at ease, guiding her to her seat with a gentle hand at her back and helping Timothy arrange his napkin properly. He ordered confidently for all of them after consulting Grace on her preferences, including a small glass of sweet wine for her and a special apple cider for Timothy. "Have you dined here before?" Grace asked, surprised by his familiarity with the establishment. "Once, about 2 years ago," Quentin admitted. "I make it a point to save a little from each cattle drive for one proper meal. Helps remind me what I'm working toward." "And what is that?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. Quentin considered her question thoughtfully. "Not just survival," he finally said. "A life worth the living. Comfort earned through honest work, perhaps someday a family to share it with." His eyes met hers across the table, and Grace felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared values and similar dreams despite their different paths. The meal was everything promised, the roast beef tender and flavorful, accompanied by fresh vegetables and potatoes that melted in their mouths. Timothy was on his best behavior, clearly awed by the surroundings and eager to impress Quentin, whom he had taken to with immediate trust. As they lingered over dessert, a rich apple pie with fresh cream, Quentin shared stories of life on the ranch that had Timothy hanging on every word. "You have many cowboys working for you?" the boy asked eagerly. "Just 2 regular hands," Quentin replied. "More during roundup and branding season. But mostly it's just me, my foreman Joe, and his son Charlie looking after the place. I'm going to be a cowboy when I grow up," Timothy declared with the certainty only an 8-year-old could muster. Quentin smiled. "It's hard work, but there's nothing like watching the sun rise over your own land, knowing everything you see is there because of your efforts." "You sound like you love it," Grace observed. "I do," Quentin confirmed, "though it gets lonely sometimes." He looked directly at her as he said this, and Grace felt that flutter in her chest again. After dinner, they strolled through town, the streets still damp from the recent rains but navigable. The spring air was fresh and cool, scented with blooming dogwoods and wild plum trees. Timothy ran ahead, pretending to be a scout on the lookout for Indians, giving Grace and Quentin a semblance of privacy as they walked side by side. "How long have you been on your own?" Quentin asked. 2 years since my parents died," Grace answered. "Though in truth, I've been running things longer. My father's health began failing 3 years before that." "That's a heavy burden for someone so young," Quentin observed. Grace shrugged. "You do what's necessary. Timothy needed stability and the store provides for us adequately." She glanced at him. "What about you?" "No family. Lost my parents before the war, 2 brothers during it." His voice was matter of fact, but Grace heard the underlying pain. Got an older sister married to a banker in Nashville, but we haven't spoken in years. Different views on, well, everything." They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Quentin spoke again. "I meant to tell you I checked on the bridge situation this morning. The town council's already making arrangements for repairs, but it'll be at least a month before it's passable again." "That will make things difficult for many people," Grace said, thinking of the farmers from across the river who brought goods to sell in town. "They're setting up a ferry service temporarily," Quentin continued. "Should be running by the end of the week, weather permitting." They had reached the mercantile, and Timothy came running back to join them, his energy seemingly inexhaustible despite the lateness of the hour. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," Grace said sincerely. Quentin smiled down at her. "The pleasure was mine." He turned to Timothy, crouching to the boy's level. "And thank you, young man, for allowing me to borrow your sister for the evening." Timothy grinned. "Can we do it again tomorrow?" Grace began to protest, but Quentin's laugh interrupted her. "Actually, I was hoping to invite both of you to a picnic tomorrow if the weather holds. There's a nice spot by the river I noticed while riding in safely away from the damaged bridge," he added, seeing Grace's immediate concern. "Please, Gracie," Timothy pleaded. Grace looked from her brother's hopeful face to Quentin's quietly expectant one. "The store could survive one afternoon without you," Quentin finished for her. "From what I saw today, your assistant Bessie is quite capable." Grace wavered, torn between responsibility and the unexpected desire to spend more time with this man who had so suddenly entered their lives. "All right," she finally agreed, "but only for a few hours." Timothy whooped with delight, and Quentin's smile widened. "I'll bring everything we need," he promised. "Noon tomorrow." After they said goodnight and Grace had tucked an excited Timothy into bed, she sat by her window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. What was she doing? In 2 days, Quentin Blackwell would ride out of Fort Smith, back to his ranch and his life. Allowing Timothy or herself to become attached would only lead to heartache, yet she couldn't deny the connection she felt to this quiet, thoughtful man. In him, she sensed a kindred spirit, someone who understood loss and perseverance, who valued the simple satisfactions of work well done and a peaceful evening. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one with wide open spaces instead of the confines of the mercantile, with a partner to share her burdens rather than bearing them alone. The vision was so alluring it frightened her, and she quickly pushed it away. Such dreams were dangerous luxuries she couldn't afford. The following day dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for a picnic. Grace arranged for Bessie to mind the store, ignoring the older woman's knowing smile, and prepared Timothy for their outing. The boy could hardly contain his excitement, chattering incessantly about horses and cowboys as they waited for Quentin to arrive. He appeared precisely at noon, leading his chestnut stallion and a gentle-looking mare he'd rented from the livery stable. Saddlebags bulging with provisions were slung across both horses. "I thought we might ride rather than walk," he explained. "The spot I have in mind is about a mile upriver." Timothy's eyes grew wide with delight. "I get to ride a real horse." "You'll ride with me," Quentin assured him, helping the boy mount the stallion before swinging up behind him. He then turned to Grace, offering his hand to help her onto the mare. "I should warn you, it's been years since I've ridden," Grace admitted as she settled into the saddle, arranging her skirts as modestly as possible. "Lucy here is gentle as a lamb," Quentin assured her. "Just hold the reins lightly and she'll follow us." True to his word, the mare followed Quentin's stallion without Grace having to do more than occasionally guide her around obstacles. They rode through town and along the riverbank, heading upstream where the waters were calmer, and the view of the surrounding hills spectacular in the spring sunshine. Quentin led them to a small clearing overlooking the river, sheltered by mature oak trees just beginning to leaf out. A natural rock formation created a perfect spot to sit and admire the view while remaining safely above the waterline. "This is beautiful," Grace remarked as Quentin helped her dismount, his strong hands at her waist sending that now familiar warmth through her body. "Found it yesterday while exploring," he replied, setting Timothy on the ground. "Thought it might make a nice change from town for both of you." He spread a blanket on the ground and unpacked a feast from his saddlebag's cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apples, and even a small jar of honey that had Timothy's eyes lighting up. They ate leisurely, enjoying the sunshine and the gentle sounds of the river flowing past. After they'd finished, Quentin showed Timothy how to skip stones across the water's surface from a safe vantage point, the boy's delight in mastering the skill evident in his frequent cries of triumph. Grace watched them together, struck by how natural they looked, the tall, broad-shouldered man patiently guiding the small boy's arm, their laughter mingling in the spring air. Quentin had a way with Timothy that spoke of genuine interest rather than mere indulgence, treating the child's questions and observations with the same respect he'd accord an adult. When Timothy wandered a short distance away to collect more suitable stones, Quentin rejoined Grace on the blanket, stretching out beside her with casual ease. "He's a fine boy," he commented, watching Timothy sort through his collection of rocks. "Smart, too. You've done well with him." "Thank you," Grace said, touched by the compliment. "He's all I have left of my family. Sometimes I worry I'm not enough, that he needs a father figure." "Children need love and stability more than anything else," Quentin observed. "You've clearly provided both." They fell into easy conversation, sharing more of their lives and dreams than they had the previous evening. Grace learned that Quentin had taught himself to read during long nights on cattle drives, working his way through any book he could get his hands on, developing a particular fondness for poetry that he admitted with some embarrassment. "There's something about words well crafted that speaks to the soul," he explained. "Makes the loneliness easier to bear somehow." In turn, she told him of her own love for books, how they provided escape from the responsibilities that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. "I read to Timothy every night," she said. "Stories of adventure and far-off places. I want him to know there's a bigger world beyond Fort Smith, even if we never see it ourselves." "Why wouldn't you see it?" Quentin asked. Grace sighed. "The store. It's our livelihood. I can't just abandon it to chase after dreams." "Dreams have their place," Quentin said quietly. "Sometimes they're what keep us going when reality gets too harsh." Their eyes met, and Grace felt something pass between them, an understanding that went beyond words. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her, and found herself both hoping for and fearing the possibility. The moment was broken by Timothy's excited shout as he discovered a turtle sunning itself on a nearby rock. Quentin rose to investigate with him, leaving Grace to collect her scattered thoughts and emotions. The afternoon passed too quickly, filled with simple pleasures, watching clouds, identifying birds, Quentin telling stories of life on the ranch that had both Grace and Timothy captivated. By the time they packed up to return to town, Grace felt more relaxed and content than she had in years. As they rode back, Timothy drowsy and leaning against Quentin's chest, Grace found herself wishing the day wouldn't end, that they could somehow stretch these precious hours into something more permanent. The thought startled her with its intensity. At the mercantile, Quentin helped Timothy down, and then Grace, his hands lingering slightly longer than necessary at her waist. There was an unspoken question in his eyes as they stood facing each other in the fading afternoon light. Would you like to come in for coffee?" Grace asked, not ready to say goodbye. Quentin smiled. "I'd like that very much." Inside, Timothy immediately began showing Quentin his small collection of treasures: rocks, feathers, a dried snake skin found near the creek last summer. Quentin examined each with appropriate interest, while Grace prepared coffee and set out the cookies she'd baked the previous day. When Timothy finally tired and went to his room to play with his wooden horses, Quentin and Grace sat at the small kitchen table, their conversation turning inevitably to his departure. "The roads should be dry enough by tomorrow," he said, a hint of reluctance in his voice. Grace nodded, surprising herself with the disappointment she felt. "Your ranch needs you." "Yes," he agreed, "though for the first time I find myself wishing duty didn't call quite so urgently." The implication hung between them, neither quite brave enough to address it directly. "Will you come back to Fort Smith?" Grace finally asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "I hadn't planned to before," Quentin admitted. "It was just a convenient stopping point on the way to Little Rock." He paused, his blue eyes intent on hers. "But now I find I have reason to return." Grace's heart quickened. "Oh, you know why, Grace," he said softly. "These past 2 days, I've never met anyone like you. Someone who understands what it means to rebuild a life from loss, who bears responsibilities without complaint, who dreams despite the weight of duty." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle. "I know it's sudden, and you have every right to think me forward, but I'd like your permission to write to you. To visit again, perhaps in a month when I bring more cattle to market." Grace's throat tightened with emotion she hadn't expected. "I'd like that," she whispered. "I can't offer much yet," Quentin continued, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "The ranch is still growing and I'm not a wealthy man, but someday—" He trailed off, seemingly embarrassed by his own presumption. "Someday," Grace prompted, her heart pounding. "Someday I hope to have enough to offer a woman a comfortable life," he finished. "A good home, security, children of her own to add to the family she already loves." The words hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibility. Grace knew he wasn't formally proposing they'd known each other mere days, but the promise of what might develop given time made her breath catch. "I think," she said carefully, "that any woman would be fortunate to receive such an offer when the time is right." Quentin's smile was like sunrise breaking over the plains. "Then I'll write," he promised, "and I'll return to Fort Smith as soon as I can." Later, after Quentin had left with a promise to see them off in the morning before his departure, Grace sat by her window again, her emotions in turmoil. Was she being foolish, allowing her heart to open to a man she barely knew? Yet something about Quentin Blackwell felt right in a way no one else ever had. His quiet strength, his gentleness with Timothy, the way he looked at her as if seeing not just the shopkeeper but the woman beneath all combined to create a pull she couldn't deny. Morning came too soon. Grace and Timothy stood on the boardwalk outside the mercantile as Quentin secured the last of his provisions to his saddle. He'd already said his goodbyes to Timothy, presenting the boy with a small pocket knife for a young man learning to be responsible, with Grace's permission. Now he turned to Grace herself, taking her hands in his. "I'll write as soon as I reach the ranch," he promised. "I'll look forward to it," she replied, fighting unexpected tears. Quentin glanced around, noting the relative privacy of the early morning street, then leaned down and kissed her cheek softly. "Until we meet again," he whispered. Grace watched him mount his horse and ride away, Timothy's small hand in hers, an unfamiliar mixture of hope and loss competing in her heart. The following weeks passed in a blur of routine: opening the store, serving customers, keeping inventory, caring for Timothy. But beneath the sameness of her days ran a current of anticipation as she waited for Quentin's promised letter. When it finally arrived, nearly 3 weeks after his departure, Grace's hands trembled as she broke the seal. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant, the letters formed with care and precision, belying the rough exterior he presented to the world. The letter spoke of his safe arrival at the ranch, the condition of his cattle after the winter, his plans for improvement to the main house. But beyond these practical matters, he wrote of missing her smile, of how Timothy's quick mind reminded him of his own childhood curiosity, of sunsets viewed from his porch that he wished she could see. Grace read and reread the letter until she knew passages by heart, then composed a careful reply, sharing news of Fort Smith, the progress on the bridge repairs, Timothy's adventures at school. She hesitated over how much of her feelings to reveal, finally admitting that their picnic remained a cherished memory, and that she looked forward to his promised return. They exchanged letters regularly over the next month, each missive revealing more of themselves than the last. Quentin wrote of his dreams for the ranch, his hope to make it not just a working cattle operation but a true home. Grace shared her concerns about Timothy's future, her own unfulfilled desire for education beyond what had been available to her in rural Arkansas. In his letters, Quentin began to paint a picture of what life at the ranch could be like, the wild beauty of the territory, the freedom and space that contrasted so sharply with the confines of town life. He described spring calving and the satisfaction of watching the herd grow, the simple pleasure of a meal cooked over an open fire after a day's work, the peace of evenings spent reading by lamplight with no sound but the wind in the pines. Grace found herself increasingly drawn to this vision, imagining herself and Timothy in the world he described. Yet practical concerns kept her grounded. The store was their security, their known quantity in an uncertain world. To leave it behind would be a leap of faith she wasn't sure she was brave enough to make. As the month neared its end, Quentin's letters began to speak more definitely of his return to Fort Smith. He planned to bring a small herd to the newly established cattle market, expecting to arrive in the first week of June. His anticipation was evident in every line, matched by Grace's own growing excitement. The day before his expected arrival, disaster struck. Grace was counting inventory when she heard shouting from the street. She rushed outside to find people running toward the eastern edge of town, where smoke was rising in an ominous dark column. Fire at the lumberyard. Someone shouted as they ran past. Grace's heart dropped. The lumberyard was dangerously close to the mercantile, with only 2 buildings between them. If the fire spread, she ran back inside, finding Bessie already gathering essential documents. "Get Timothy from school," Grace instructed, reaching for the cash box. "Meet me at the church if the fire spreads this far." The next hours passed in a blur of fear and activity. The volunteer fire brigade fought valiantly, but the dry spring had left everything like tinder, and a stiff breeze pushed the flames relentlessly westward. Building after building caught fire despite the bucket brigades formed by townspeople. By nightfall, the mercantile was gone, along with a third of Fort Smith's business district. Grace and Timothy stood with other displaced families in the church, watching as their livelihood and home burned to ashes. "Everything's gone, Gracie," Timothy whispered, his small face streaked with soot and tears. Grace held him close. "Not everything. We have each other. We'll rebuild somehow." But the brave words rang hollow even to her own ears. The store had been insured, but not for its full value, and rebuilding would take time and money she didn't have. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Grace felt truly overwhelmed by the challenges facing her. They spent an uncomfortable night on pallets in the church, along with other families displaced by the fire. In the morning, Grace forced herself to return to the mercantile, hoping to salvage something from the rubble. The sight that greeted her was devastating. Nothing remained but charred beams and ash, the labor of generations reduced to nothing in a single night. As she stood staring at the ruins, a familiar voice called her name. She turned to find Quentin dismounting from his horse, his face etched with concern. Without hesitation, he strode to her and pulled her into his arms. "I just rode in," he said, holding her close. "Saw the damage from the ridge. Are you and Timothy all right?" Grace nodded against his chest, too overcome to speak. For the first time since the fire started, she allowed herself to cry, her tears soaking into his shirt as he stroked her hair and murmured reassurances. When she finally composed herself, she pulled back slightly, embarrassed by her display. "I'm sorry, it's just, everything's gone. The store, our home, all our possessions." "Where's Timothy?" Quentin asked, his arm still around her shoulders, still at the church with Bessie. "I wanted to see if anything could be saved before telling him it's all gone." Quentin surveyed the ruins with a practiced eye. "Nothing here worth salvaging," he concluded gently. "What will you do now?" Grace shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. The insurance will cover some of it, but not enough to rebuild immediately. We could stay with Bessie for a while, but her place is tiny, and she can barely support herself as it is." Quentin was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I have a suggestion," he finally said, "though I'm afraid you might think it improper or presumptuous." "At this point, I'm open to any suggestion," Grace replied wearily. "Come back to the ranch with me," Quentin said simply. "You and Timothy both. There's plenty of room, and you'd be welcome for as long as you need to decide your next steps." Grace stared at him in shock. "Quentin, I couldn't possibly—" "Before you refuse," he interrupted, "hear me out. My housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins, lives at the ranch with her husband who helps with the cattle. You'd have proper chaperonage if that's your concern. Timothy would have space to run and play, away from the memories of what's been lost. And you'd have time to consider your options without the pressure of immediate necessity." Grace hesitated, torn between propriety and pragmatism. What would people think? "Does that matter more than what's best for you and Timothy right now?" Quentin countered gently. "Fort Smith is going to be rebuilding for months. Construction crews, temporary housing, limited supplies. It's no place for a boy who's just lost his home." His logic was sound, but Grace still wavered. "I don't want to be a charity case, Quentin." His expression softened. "You could never be that, Grace. If it makes you feel better, consider it a loan. You can help Mrs. Wilkins with household duties, work in the kitchen garden, earn your keep until you decide what's next. But know that the offer comes with no expectations beyond allowing me to help someone I care about deeply." The sincerity in his eyes broke through her remaining resistance. "When would we leave?" she asked, signaling her tentative acceptance. "Tomorrow morning," Quentin replied. "I need to arrange for a wagon. You can't ride all that way, and Timothy's too small for his own horse. I'll see to the details if you'll gather whatever you and the boy still have." The following dawn found Grace and Timothy seated beside Quentin on the bench of a rented wagon, their few salvaged possessions and some donated clothing packed in the back. The destruction of the fire was behind them, and ahead stretched the open territory that would lead to Quentin's ranch. Timothy, resilient as only children can be, had rebounded quickly from the initial shock and was now excited about the adventure ahead. His chatter filled the first hours of the journey as Quentin patiently answered his endless questions about ranch life. "Will there be real cowboys?" he asked for perhaps the fifth time. 2 of the best, Quentin assured him. Joe and Charlie will teach you to ride properly if you'd like. The boy's eyes widened. My own horse. We have a gentle pony that needs exercising, Quentin said with a smile. Just right for a boy your size. Grace watched their interaction with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Quentin's kindness was undeniable, but what would happen when the initial crisis passed? Would he expect them to leave once she received the insurance money? Did she even want to return to Fort Smith and start over from nothing? The journey to the ranch took 2 days, with an overnight stay at a small way station where Quentin secured a private room for Grace and Timothy, while he slept in the common area with other travelers. By the time they crested the final ridge overlooking his property, Grace was sore from the wagon bench and anxious about what awaited them. What she saw took her breath away. The valley below was lush with spring grass, dotted with grazing cattle. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows just coming into full leaf. And nestled against the backdrop of distant hills stood a house larger and more impressive than Grace had imagined from Quentin's modest descriptions. Built of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, the ranch house looked both substantial and welcoming. Nearby stood a barn, bunkhouse, and several smaller outbuildings, all well maintained. This was no struggling operation but a thriving ranch that spoke of careful management and prosperity. You didn't tell me, Grace said softly. Quentin looked at her, confusion in his eyes. Tell you what? That you've built all this, she clarified, gesturing to the valley below. You spoke as if the ranch was still developing, still a dream in progress. Quentin shrugged, a hint of color rising in his tanned cheeks. It is to me. I see what it could become more clearly than what it already is. He clicked to the horses, starting them down the slope. Besides, a man learns humility in the war. Boasting about what you've built feels like tempting fate. As they approached the house, a woman emerged onto the porch, gray-haired, solidly built, with a face that combined no-nonsense practicality with inherent kindness. Behind her appeared a tall, lanky cowboy with weathered features and a younger version of himself, presumably Joe and his son Charlie. Mrs. Wilkins, Quentin called as they pulled up before the house. I've brought guests who will be staying with us for a time. The housekeeper came forward, assessing Grace and Timothy with kind but shrewd eyes. The lady and boy you wrote about, she said with a nod. I've got the east bedroom ready for the little one and the blue room for Miss Turner. Grace was startled that Quentin had written ahead about them, but grateful for the matter-of-fact welcome. Mrs. Wilkins helped her down from the wagon while Joe and Charlie began unloading their meager possessions. You'll be wanting to wash up after the journey, Mrs. Wilkins said practically. I'll show you to your rooms, and there's hot water for bathing whenever you're ready. Supper's at 6 sharp. The interior of the house matched its exterior, solid, comfortable, and surprisingly refined. Polished wood floors, well-crafted furniture, shelves lined with books, and even a piano in the sitting room spoke of a home built with care and attention to detail. Timothy's room adjoined Grace's, both overlooking the eastern valley with its view of distant hills. Clean linens, fresh flowers in simple vases, and pitchers of water awaited them, along with towels and soap for washing away the dust of travel. This is very kind, Grace said to Mrs. Wilkins as the older woman showed them the bathing room with its large copper tub. We don't want to be a bother. Mrs. Wilkins snorted softly. No bother having women around again. Been just men here too long. House needs a woman's touch. She patted Grace's arm. Mr. Blackwell wrote that you lost everything in the fire. Hard thing that. You take your time settling in. No rush to decide what comes next. Left alone with Timothy, Grace helped her brother wash up and change into clean clothes donated by the church ladies before his departure. The boy was vibrating with excitement, eager to explore his new surroundings. "Can I go see the horses, Gracie? Please." "After we're both presentable," she promised. "And only if Mr. Blackwell or one of his men goes with you. This isn't town, Timothy. There are different dangers here." By the time Grace had bathed and changed into her one remaining decent dress, a simple blue cotton thankfully spared from the fire, because it had been at the laundress, Timothy was practically bouncing with impatience. They found Quentin in his study, bent over account books that he quickly set aside when they appeared in the doorway. "Feeling better after the journey?" he asked, rising to greet them. "Much, thank you," Grace replied. "Your home is lovely, Quentin. Far grander than I expected from your descriptions." He looked almost embarrassed by the compliment. "It's comfortable, not grand. My father always said a man should build according to his needs, not his pride." "Can I see the horses now?" Timothy interrupted, unable to contain himself any longer. Quentin laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "Of course. Charlie's in the barn now, getting them settled for the night. He'd be happy to show you around." The days that followed established a routine that Grace found surprisingly comfortable. She rose early, helping Mrs. Wilkins with breakfast before the men came in from their morning chores. Timothy quickly became Charlie's shadow, following the 16-year-old cowboy everywhere he was allowed, soaking up knowledge about horses, cattle, and ranch life with boundless enthusiasm. Grace found ways to make herself useful, helping in the kitchen, tending the vegetable garden that supplied much of the ranch's produce, mending clothes for the cowboys who seemed pathetically grateful for her skilled needle. Evenings were spent on the porch when weather permitted, or in the sitting room when it didn't, with Quentin often reading aloud from one of his many books, while Grace sewed and Timothy played quietly with wooden figures Charlie had carved for him. 2 weeks into their stay, Grace received word from Fort Smith. The insurance company had settled her claim, a sum substantial enough to rebuild a modest store, but far less than needed to replace everything they had lost. The letter included news that reconstruction was proceeding slowly in town, with lumber at a premium and skilled builders commanding high wages. "What do you think?" Quentin asked that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Timothy was already in bed, exhausted from a day spent learning to ride the gentle pony Quentin had promised. Grace sighed, folding the letter carefully. "I don't know. The money won't go far in town right now, not with everyone rebuilding at once. And without a place to live while the store is reconstructed." "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need," Quentin reminded her. "There's no hurry to decide." Grace turned to look at him, studying his profile in the fading light. Over the past weeks, she'd come to know him better, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, his deep intelligence that belied his limited formal education. Each day, she found herself more drawn to him, more able to imagine a future that included him permanently. "Why did you really invite us here, Quentin?" she asked suddenly. "The truth, please." He met her gaze directly, no evasion in his blue eyes. "Because from the moment I pulled you from that bridge, I knew you were someone special, Grace Turner. Because I couldn't bear the thought of you struggling alone after losing everything. Because I wanted you to see what life could be like here with me, before you made any decisions about rebuilding in Fort Smith." The honesty of his answer took her breath away. "That's very direct." "I'm not a man for games or pretense," Quentin replied simply. "I care for you deeply, Grace, more than I thought possible after knowing someone such a short time, and I see how Timothy thrives here, how quickly he's taken to ranch life." He hesitated, then continued more softly. I know it's soon too soon, perhaps, but I want you to consider staying, not as my guest, but as my wife." Grace's heart seemed to stop, then race forward at twice its normal pace. "Quentin, you don't need to answer now," he interrupted gently. "I know it's a lot to consider. You'd be giving up the independence of running your own business, taking on the uncertain life of a rancher's wife. I just want you to know that the option exists, that there's a place for you here that could be permanent if you wish it." Grace was silent, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't fully name. Part of her wanted to accept immediately, to throw caution to the wind and embrace the future he offered. Another part held back, wary of making such a momentous decision from a position of vulnerability. "I need time," she finally said. Quentin nodded, reaching over to cover her hand with his own. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." The following days took on a new significance as Grace consciously evaluated life at the ranch through the lens of permanence rather than temporary refuge. She observed Quentin more carefully, how he interacted with his men, how he handled the inevitable crises of ranch life, how he treated Timothy with increasing affection and responsibility. She noted the way he consulted her on household decisions, valuing her opinion even in matters where his experience exceeded hers. She appreciated his patience when teaching her to ride, his genuine pleasure in her small accomplishments, his respect for her independence even as he offered support. Timothy, meanwhile, blossomed in ways Grace hadn't thought possible. The timid boy from town transformed into a confident young ranch hand in training, eager to learn and quick to master new skills. He followed Quentin with undisguised hero worship, soaking up the man's quiet lessons in horsemanship, animal husbandry, and the code of behavior that governed life in the territories. One evening, nearly a month after their arrival, Grace tucked Timothy into bed as usual, listening to his prayers that now included thanks for ponies, cowboys, and Mr. Quentin who saved us twice. "You like it here, Timothy?" she asked softly after he finished. The boy nodded vigorously. "I love it, Gracie. Can we stay forever? Charlie says I can have my own calf to raise if we stay, and Mr. Quentin said he'd teach me to shoot a real gun when I'm older. Would you miss Fort Smith, your friends from school, the store?" Timothy considered this seriously. "I'd miss some things," he admitted, "but I like it better here. There's more space and no one treats me like a baby, and Mr. Quentin needs us, Charlie says." "Oh, what else does Charlie say?" Grace asked, curious about what the young cowboy might have revealed. "He says the boss has been different since we came. Happier. He says the ranch needs a woman's touch and a child's laughter." Timothy yawned, his eyelids growing heavy. "And he says Mr. Quentin looks at you like his pa used to look at his ma before she died." Grace kissed her brother's forehead, her heart full. "Sleep well, little man. We'll talk more tomorrow." She found Quentin in his study, as had become their custom in the evenings after Timothy was asleep. These quiet hours had become precious to them both, time to talk without interruption, to share thoughts and dreams, to simply enjoy each other's company. Tonight, however, Grace felt a new resolve as she entered the room. Quentin looked up from his book, his smile warming as he saw her. "Timothy asleep," nearly before his head hit the pillow, Grace confirmed, settling into the comfortable chair opposite his. "He rode with Charlie all afternoon, checking fence lines." Quentin nodded. "The boy has a natural seat on a horse. He'll make a fine horseman with proper training." "He'd like that," Grace said softly. "He asked tonight if we could stay forever." Quentin's expression remained carefully neutral, though his eyes sharpened with interest. "And what did you tell him?" "That we'd talk about it tomorrow." She took a deep breath. "But I think I'm ready to give him an answer now." Quentin set his book aside, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." "I've been thinking about your proposal," Grace began, "considering what it would mean for Timothy and me to stay here permanently. And I've realized several things," she continued. "First, that Timothy is happier here than I've ever seen him. Second, that the life you've built here is remarkable, not just the ranch itself, but the community of it, the way everyone works together toward common goals." Quentin waited, allowing her to proceed at her own pace. "Third," Grace said, meeting his eyes directly, "I've realized that I care for you, Quentin Blackwell, in ways I never expected to care for anyone again after my parents died. You've shown me kindness without condescension, respect without reservation, and affection without expectation of return." She rose from her chair and moved to stand before him. "If your offer still stands, I would be honored to become your wife, to help you build this ranch into the dream you envision, to raise Timothy in this place where he can become the man he's meant to be." Quentin stood, taking her hands in his expression a mixture of joy and disbelief. "You're certain? I don't want you to accept out of gratitude or necessity." Grace smiled up at him. "I'm accepting because I love you," she said simply, "because I can't imagine my future without you in it anymore." With a sound that was half laugh, half sob, Quentin pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When he finally released her slightly, it was only to frame her face with his hands and kiss her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I love you, Grace Turner," he whispered against her lips, "and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this decision." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church that served the scattered ranches of the region. Timothy stood proudly as Quentin's best man, while Mrs. Wilkins sniffled happily in the front pew. Joe and Charlie had decorated the church with wildflowers gathered from the valley, and the entire community turned out to celebrate the union of the respected rancher and his bride. Grace wore a simple white dress ordered from the nearest town, her hair adorned with the same wildflowers that filled the church. Quentin, almost unrecognizable in a new suit, watched her walk down the aisle with undisguised wonder, as if he couldn't believe his good fortune. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their vows spoken with clear conviction. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin's kiss was both reverent and promising, sealing their commitment before God and community. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with food, music, and dancing in the barn cleared for the occasion. As the newly wedded couple swayed together to a fiddle's sweet melody, Grace looked up at her husband with contentment warming her heart. "Happy?" Quentin asked softly. "More than I thought possible," she replied honestly, "though I still can't quite believe how we came to this moment. If that bridge hadn't collapsed, I'd have found you some other way," Quentin said with conviction. "Some things are meant to be, Grace. I believe that now more than ever." Later that night, in the privacy of the bedroom that was now theirs to share, Grace discovered new dimensions to the gentle cowboy who had stolen her heart. His touch was reverent yet passionate, his patience infinite as they learned each other in the most intimate ways. In his arms, she found a belonging she had never known before, a completion that transcended physical union to touch her very soul. In the years that followed, the Blackwell Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Grace brought her merchant's acumen to the business side of ranching, keeping accounts with precision and negotiating cattle contracts with surprising skill. Quentin expanded their holdings, adding adjacent land when possible, improving their stock with carefully selected breeding bulls. Timothy grew tall and strong, developing into a young man who combined Quentin's quiet competence with Grace's compassionate heart. By his 16th birthday, he was managing significant responsibilities on the ranch, proud to be Quentin's right hand and heir apparent. The family expanded as well. A year after their marriage, Grace gave birth to a son they named James, after Quentin's father. 2 years later came Elizabeth, a daughter with her mother's honey blonde hair and her father's determined blue eyes. The children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, adored by their parents and doted on by the extended family of ranch hands who considered the Blackwell children partly their own responsibility. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Quentin surprised Grace with a trip back to Fort Smith. The town had rebuilt after the fire, though many businesses had changed hands or relocated. The site of the former Turner Mercantile now housed a lawyer's office, all traces of their previous life erased by time and progress. "You ever regret it?" Quentin asked as they stood on the newly reconstructed Henderson Bridge, the site of their first meeting. "Not rebuilding here, I mean." Grace shook her head, leaning into his embrace as they looked out over the Arkansas River, calm and peaceful in the summer evening. "Never." The fire that seemed like disaster was actually a blessing in disguise. It freed me to find where I truly belonged. Quentin kissed her temple, his arm secure around her waist. "And where is that, Mrs. Blackwell?" Grace smiled up at him, her heart as full as it had been on their wedding day. "Wherever you are," she said simply. "You caught me when I was falling in more ways than one. Everything good in my life now began the moment you said you'd catch my fall yourself." "Best decision I ever made," Quentin murmured, drawing her closer. "And one I'd make again, every day for the rest of my life." As the sun set over Fort Smith, painting the river in shades of gold and crimson, Grace and Quentin Blackwell turned toward their waiting carriage, and the journey home not to the town where they'd met, but to the ranch they'd built together, where 3 children waited eagerly for their parents' return, and where the promise made on a collapsing bridge had blossomed into a life neither could have imagined in that moment of crisis and courage. Years later, when their grandchildren begged for the story of how they met, Quentin would always begin the same way. "I was just riding into town when I heard people shouting, 'She's hanging from the bridge,' and without thinking twice, I told them, 'Then I'll catch her fall myself.'" The children would listen wide-eyed as he described their grandmother dangling precariously above the raging river, his desperate rush onto the collapsing structure, their hands connecting just as the bridge gave way. Grace would always smile at his telling, knowing he downplayed his heroism while emphasizing the hand of fate that brought them together. But in quiet moments alone, she would remind him of the truth that he had saved her in every way a person could be saved, that his courage that day had changed not just her life but Timothy's, and eventually the lives of their children and grandchildren as well. "One moment of bravery," she would say, "can echo through generations." And Quentin would always reply, "It wasn't bravery, my love. It was destiny. I just had the good sense to reach out and grab it with both hands." On their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, the elderly couple returned once more to Fort Smith. The town had changed beyond recognition, modernizing with the new century, but Henderson Bridge remained, rebuilt stronger after that long-ago storm. Standing in the spot where they'd first met, Quentin, his hair now white but his blue eyes still clear and sharp, took Grace's hand in his. "Would you do it all again?" he asked softly. "Knowing everything, the hardships, the joys, the work, the rewards," Grace, her beauty mellowed but not diminished by the decades, smiled up at her husband with the same love that had blossomed in her heart all those years ago. "In a heartbeat," she replied. "I'd fall from that bridge 1,000 times if it meant you would always be there to catch me." As they walked slowly back across the bridge, hand in hand as they had walked through life together. Neither looked back at the river below. Their story had begun there, but it had flowered elsewhere on a ranch built with love and determination, in a family created through both blood and choice, in a partnership that had weathered half a century of challenges and triumphs. And if anyone observing the elderly couple had asked what secret had sustained their obvious devotion through 50 years of marriage, they would have received the same answer from both. Love is not just the falling, Quentin would have said, but the catching. And Grace would have added, and sometimes the most important journey of your life begins the moment you think all is lost.